Pedro María was a ghost carved from the aridity of the border between Mexico and the United States. Born and raised under the relentless sun of the Sonoran Desert, he moved through that landscape as if it were an extension of his own body. Every cactus, every canyon, every dusty trail was a part of his blood memory. In the 2000s, he was a coyote, a people smuggler, a figure whispered about in desperate border towns. His reputation was twofold: expensive but safe. He was not a good man, not in the sense the civilized world understood. He was a pragmatic creature, hardened by survival, with eyes that reflected the empty vastness of the desert. To tell this story is a heavy burden, a dive into one man's darkness, and if you could give me the strength of 1,000 subscribers, I will feel I am not doing this alone. Let me know in the comments from what city or country you are following this journey, so that we know we are not alone in our own battles. His trade was a brutal science. To Pedro, the migrants were cargo, a precious and fragile commodity that he transported from point A to point B for a price that guaranteed his exclusive dedication. He operated with a calculated coldness, an emotional distance that protected him from the soup of desperation and hope that surrounded him. However, he possessed a peculiar code of honor, almost extinct among his kind. He did not abandon his cargo, ever. While other coyotes left the weak behind or handed them over to bandits for an extra payment, Pedro fulfilled his part of the deal with the seriousness of a priest performing a sacred rite. This integrity was not born of goodness, but of a grim professional pride. He was the best at what he did, and his word, in the middle of that lawless hell, was the only thing of value he still possessed. On that specific crossing, his cargo consisted of 12 souls, but his focus was magnetically drawn to a small family. Javier, a man with a farmer's hands and eyes full of an ancestral weariness. His wife, Anna, whose face, though marked by worry, still held a resilient beauty. And their daughter, Sophia, a 6-year-old girl with eyes as dark and bright as obsidian. They were the archetype of desperate hope, having sold everything they owned for a minimal chance at a different life. Pedro saw them as he saw all the others, a contract to be fulfilled. But there was something in the way. Little Sophia looked at the vastness of the desert, not with fear, but with a reverent curiosity that began to corrode the armor he had built around his heart. The first link was forged without words. During a brief stop under the scant shade of a rock formation, Sophia approached him as he stood apart, watching the horizon. She extended her small hand, offering him half of her corn wafer, the last of their meager provisions. Pedro stared at her, his face a mask of indifference, and motioned for her to go away. But the girl did not retreat. She just stood there, her hand outstretched, a small sacrifice offered with the purity only a child possesses. Reluctantly, he took the wafer. In the touch of their fingers, he felt her fragility, a violent contrast to the roughness of his own existence. That simple, silent gesture was the first crack in his rigidly controlled world. The journey plunged deeper into the heart of the desert, and the environment became an active enemy. The sun was an incandescent hammer during the day, and the night brought a biting cold that seemed to seep into the bones. Pedro guided the group with a ruthless efficiency, his instincts as sharp as broken glass. He taught them to find moisture in cacti, to read the stars so as not to get lost, and to move in absolute silence under the cloak of darkness. He was a master of that wild domain, and his competence was the only thing that stood between those people and an anonymous, forgotten death. He offered no comfort or words of encouragement, only short, precise instructions. His presence was an austere guarantee, the promise that as long as they followed him, death would have to fight to reach them. On one of those freezing nights, as the group huddled in a small cave to shelter from the howling wind, Pedro remained on watch at the entrance, a motionless sentinel against the starry sky. He could hear the whispers of Javier and Ana, planning a future that seemed like a distant fantasy. A small apartment, a construction job, a school for Sofia. They were dreams so simple, so humble, that they sounded like an accusation against the brutality of the world that forced them to risk everything for them. Pedro felt an unusual weight in his chest. That sound, the sound of human hope, was a strange noise in his universe of silence and survival, and it troubled him deeply, reminding him of a part of himself he believed had died long ago. Later that night, little Sofia, unable to sleep, walked over to him. Fear was a shadow on her face. She said nothing, just sat beside him, huddled, and looked into the darkness. Breaking his own code of silence, Pedro pointed to the sky. "See those stars there?" he muttered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "They form a scorpion. They say it guides lost travelers." Sofia looked at him, her eyes large and trusting. "Are you going to guide us?" she asked. For an instant, Pedro saw not a client, but a child entrusting her life to him. "I promised I'd get you to the other side," he said, and the word sounded more like an oath than a simple contract. "Now go to sleep." The promise hung in the cold desert air, a bond sealed. As dawn approached on the final day of the crossing, a subtle change in the atmosphere put Pedro's instincts on high alert. The silence of the desert became heavy, oppressive. The nocturnal sounds of animals had ceased abruptly. It was an unnatural stillness, the kind of silence that precedes the violence of a predator. Pedro stopped, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of the old, worn revolver he carried at his waist. He scanned the shadows, the contours of the rocks, his body tensed like a steel cord. He didn't know what was coming, but his visceral knowledge of that place told him they were no longer alone. The desert, which until then had been a passive adversary, was about to reveal the true monsters hiding in its merciless heart. The silence was broken not by a sound, but by a vibration in the earth, a growing tremor that turned into the roar of hungry engines. Two old, battered pickup trucks appeared on the horizon, tearing through the quiet dawn and kicking up clouds of dust that looked like dancing ghosts under the pale light. They circled the small group like sharks, their headlights trapping them in blinding beams. Men jumped from the truck beds before the vehicles even came to a complete stop, their dark figures armed with rifles and shrouded in an aura of casual violence. They wore skull bandanas that dehumanized their faces, turning them into avatars of death. The fragile hope that had kept the group standing instantly evaporated, replaced by a paralyzing terror that froze the air and turned every breath into an act of dread. One man stood out from the others, moving with the predatory calm of an alpha wolf. He didn't need to run or shout. His presence commanded absolute and dreadful authority. It was El Carnicero. He walked slowly among the cowering migrants, his gaze sweeping over them with the disdain of someone inspecting livestock. He stopped before Pedro, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. "Pedro María," he said, his voice low, almost intimate, which made it even more terrifying. "The famous desert guide. I see business is good." There was no question in his voice, only the assertion of an indisputable power. In that moment, Pedro knew this was not a robbery. It was an act of domination, a spectacle of cruelty orchestrated by a man who fed on the desperation of others. The border had a new devil, and they had just walked into his personal hell. The violence that followed was methodical, a ritual of humiliation. Pedro was the first to be neutralized. A swift, professional blow brought him to his knees, the cold barrel of a gun pressed against the back of his neck, forcing him to be the main audience for this macabre opera. He, the man who knew every secret of the desert, was reduced to a helpless spectator. He watched Javier try to stand in front of his family, a final act of paternal courage, only to be struck down. With shocking brutality, he heard Anna's screams, a lament that tore through his soul as she was dragged away from her husband. Every sound, every blow, every plea was a nail being hammered into the coffin of his identity. He was no longer a guide, no longer the master of this place. He was just a failure, witnessing the consequence of his own arrogance. Then, El Carnicero's eyes fell on Sofia. The terror that followed was of a different nature, more intimate and profane. He grabbed her, and the little girl's cry, sharp and desperate, pierced Pedro's heart with the force of 1,000 knives, the promise he had made to her. "I promise you'll see the sun rise on the other side," echoed in his mind like a damnation. In a fit of blind rage, he lunged, a primal roar tearing from his throat, but he was silenced by a rifle butt that threw him face first into the dust. Fallen, with the taste of blood and dirt in his mouth, his blurred vision focused on one last image. The exact moment light went out in Sofia's eyes. In that instant, something inside Pedro broke irrevocably, and the man he was died along with her. The massacre ended with laughter, the most obscene sound the desert had ever heard. El Carnicero approached Pedro, who lay in a pool of his own helplessness, and nudged him with his boot. "Leave this one for the vultures," he ordered with a final contempt. "The legend of the great coyote ends here." A sharp, hot explosion of pain hit him, and the world began to dissolve into a growing darkness. As his consciousness faded, the first rays of sun touched the peaks of the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A magnificent, cruel dawn, fulfilling nature's promise, but mocking the broken promise of a man. The desert returned to its silence, now an open-air cemetery holding the body of a man who would need to die in order to be reborn. Consciousness returned to Pedro like a tide of pain. He awoke under the merciless sun, the taste of copper and dust in his mouth, his body a map of agony. For a moment death seemed a welcome relief, but then the image of Sofia flooded his mind. Not the smiling girl, but the fragile figure in the instant life left her. That memory was the antidote to the poison of apathy. Survival was no longer an instinct, it became a duty. He would not live for himself, but to be the instrument of a vengeance that would consume him completely. Getting to his feet, every movement a torture, he made a silent oath to the dead. If you have ever felt a pain so deep it erases the world, know that it is from this darkness that we are sometimes reborn. Subscribing to this channel is a way of saying that no story of struggle should be forgotten, and I thank you for giving me that strength. His journey back was a testament to his symbiosis with the desert. Wounded and dehydrated, he dragged himself for miles, reading the land in search of salvation. He found water hidden in the pulp of a barrel cactus, chewed bitter roots to quell his hunger, and sheltered from the sun in rock crevices that would have gone unnoticed by any other. The desert, the stage of his greatest humiliation, became his accomplice in survival. Each painful step hardened him more, burning away the fat of his old life and forging in its place muscles of pure purpose. The man who emerged from that vastness days later was a spectre, thinner, darker, with eyes that held the cold fire of a dead star. The coyote had died. The hunter was being born. He found refuge at Father Miguel's mission, a small adobe church that served as an oasis of mercy in the brutality of the border. The priest, a man of unwavering faith and calloused hands, knew Pedro from other times, having often cared for the migrants he left near the town. Without asking questions, the priest cleaned and stitched his wound, offered him food and a place to rest. However, he noticed the change. The cynical pragmatism in Pedro's eyes had been replaced by something far more frightening, a terrible absolute certainty. It was the look of a man who had already visited hell and decided to go back, but this time to drag others with him. Pedro's stillness was heavier and more threatening than any scream. The confrontation was inevitable. One evening, under the light of a single candle in the sacristy, Father Miguel tried to reach Pedro's soul. "Vengeance is the Lord's, my son," he said softly. "What they did is a monstrous sin, but if you become like them, your soul will also be lost." Pedro, who was methodically cleaning a rusted revolver he had acquired, didn't even look up. "Your God wasn't in that desert, Father." "I was," he replied, his voice a gravelly rasp. "They don't have souls to be judged. They are just animals. And I have become the hunter. Pray for them if you wish. I will make sure they have a reason for your prayers." The conversation ended there, an impassable abyss between faith and fury. In the following days, the mission became his sanctuary and his training ground. As he recovered physically, his mind worked tirelessly. He was no longer a guide of people, but a collector of whispers. He listened to the horror stories of the arriving migrants, each account of Los Espectros, adding fuel to his hatred. He mapped their routes, their meeting points, their habits. He learned about their structure, their hierarchy, their fears. He used the shared pain of that community of the dispossessed as his intelligence network. To them, he was just another broken soul, recovering under the priest's roof. No one suspected that behind his silence, he was sharpening the blade of his retribution, preparing to dissect the organization that had stolen everything from him. The first hunt was an act of patience and precision. His target was a halcon, a low-level scout for the cartel, an arrogant young man who boasted in a local bar about the terror they inflicted on the defenseless. Pedro followed him for 2 days, studying. His routine, his complacency. He didn't confront him in the town. Instead, he waited for the young man to enter his territory, the desert. On a remote trail, Pedro used his knowledge of the terrain to create a simple trap, a tripwire that sent the man's motorcycle tumbling. The transition from his old life to the new was seamless. The same skills he had used to guide lives toward hope, he now used to guide a life to its end. The confrontation was quick and ugly. The young man, stunned and injured, stood no chance. Pedro emerged from the shadows, not as a man, but as an apparition of the desert itself. The fear in the boy's eyes was profound, the recognition that he was facing a force of nature. For a brief instant, Pedro hesitated, seeing not a monster, but a stupid kid. Then the image of Sophia's face, pale in the dust, flashed in his mind, and the hesitation turned to ice. The death was personal, silent, and brutal. Afterwards, standing over the body, Pedro felt no triumph, no relief, only a vast, cold emptiness. He took his knife and, on the man's skin, carved the figure of a scorpion. It was his signature, a promise. The body was found 2 days later, and the scorpion mark sent a wave of unease through the ranks of Los Espectros. Initially, they dismissed it as a rival gang dispute, but the calculated brutality and the remote location didn't fit. It was a different kind of death, more intimate, when a second and a third cartel member turned up dead in similar circumstances, always in the desert and always with the same sinister mark. The whispers began. They spoke of a ghost, a demonio del desierto, that was hunting them in their own territory. Fear, the cartel's primary tool, was being subtly turned against them. The legend of Pedro María, the desert justiciar, began to be born, not from hope, but from symmetrical terror. Pedro became a relentless force, using the desert as his deadliest weapon. He didn't need an army. He was the army. He led small groups of cartel men into dead-end canyons where he hunted them one by one. He used the sun to blind them, snakes as sentinels, and the wind to mask his movements. His reputation grew on 2 opposing fronts. For the criminals, his name, or rather his symbol, El Escorpión, became a curse, an omen of a lonely and terrible death in the wilderness. For the migrants and the oppressed inhabitants of the border towns, the same legend was a thread of dark hope, proof that even the most feared monsters could bleed and feel fear. However, his solitary war had a collateral cost. In response to the attacks, Los Espectros became even more cruel and paranoid. The violence on the border escalated, and many innocents were caught in the crossfire. Father Miguel confronted Pedro with this bitter truth. "Look what your revenge is causing," he pleaded. "You are watering this land with more blood, not with justice. For every one of them you kill, They kill 3 of ours." Pedro felt the weight of those words. His goal was to punish the guilty, not to increase the suffering of the innocent. The internal conflict gnawed at him. He was becoming the catalyst for more pain, a monster begetting other monsters in an endless cycle of violence. The certainty of his mission began to be haunted by the shadow of its consequences. He realized that random attacks would not be enough. He needed precise information to strike at the heart of the organization, to be surgical in his violence. The migrants' stories were no longer sufficient. He needed someone on the inside. Whispers on the border led him to a name: Elena, a woman who had been an important piece in the cartel's logistics, but had been betrayed by El Carnicero and left for dead. She had survived and now lived in the shadows, nursing a hatred as deep as Pedro's. Tracking her down was a challenge. She was a ghost, just like him, moving through an underworld of contacts and hideouts. He finally found her in a smoke-filled bar in Ciudad Juarez, a place where desperation was the strongest drink on the menu. The meeting was a dance of distrust. Elena, with eyes as hard as agate and a scar that ran through her eyebrow, was not a victim seeking salvation. She was a pragmatic survivor, hardened and dangerous. She sized him up with a cold skepticism as he spoke. "Revenge is a nice story to tell the dead," she scoffed. "I prefer profit. What's in it for me?" Pedro stared at her, his intensity filling the small space between them. "I don't have money," he said, "but I offer you something better. I offer you the chance to watch El Carnicero's empire burn to the ground. I am the fire. You just need to tell me where to pour the gasoline." The proposal hung between them, an alliance forged in mutual hatred. Reluctantly, Elena agreed. Her motivation was a complex mixture of revenge and opportunism. She saw in Pedro the perfect tool, a man with the skill and suicidal fury to do what she could not, in exchange for a cut of any money he seized from the cartel and the elimination of her former rivals. She would become his eyes and ears. She began to feed him vital information: smuggling routes, names of corrupt cops on the payroll, delivery schedules, and most importantly, the weaknesses and habits of El Carnicero's lieutenants. Pedro's war was about to evolve. It would cease to be a series of instinctive attacks and become a strategic, calculated campaign aimed at dismantling Los Espectros, piece by piece. The first target Elena gave him was a man named Ricardo El Chacal Vargas, El Carnicero's right-hand man and the one who personally oversaw the tax collected from migrants. Attacking Ricardo was a massive escalation, a direct declaration of war on the cartel's leadership. It was a decision that would set him on a path of no return, transforming him from a ghostly nuisance into public enemy number 1. It is at this point that you decide there is no turning back, that the only way out is through the fire. If this journey somehow resonates with you, the courage to face what seems impossible, please consider subscribing. Each new name is a reminder that we are not alone when making difficult choices and moving forward. The plan of attack was meticulous, a masterpiece of desert guerrilla warfare. Elena reported that El Chacal personally inspected a remote route every first Friday of the month, always at the same time, a display of arrogance and power. Pedro spent a week at the Egypt location, preparing the ground. He didn't plan a simple ambush, but a series of sequential traps designed to disorient, separate, and eliminate Ricardo's escort before isolating the main target. He used improvised explosives to block the escape route and positioned himself on a high vantage point, turning a stretch of the desert into his personal chessboard. The hunt was becoming more sophisticated, more lethal. The execution was tense and imperfect. El Chacal's escort was larger than Elena had anticipated, and they reacted with more professionalism than the low-level thugs Pedro had previously faced. The desert filled with the sound of automatic gunfire, an industrial noise that desecrated the landscape. Pedro was forced to improvise, moving between the rocks like a spectre, using the echo of the shots to confuse his enemy's positions. He was wounded, a bullet grazing his arm and reminding him of his mortality, but in the end, his strategy and his intimate knowledge of the terrain prevailed. He cornered El Chacal alone, unarmed and terrified. The predator turned prey. The lieutenant's death was Pedro's battle cry. The death of a high-ranking lieutenant like El Chacal could not be ignored. The news exploded in the border's underworld, and the scorpion mark, found again on the body, became the center of a storm of fear and speculation. El Carnicero, who until then had treated the ghost as a pest to be exterminated, now realized he was facing an intelligent and determined enemy. Ricardo's loss was not just personal, it was a logistical and financial blow to his operations. El Carnicero's fury became a sick obsession. He no longer just wanted to kill El Escorpión, he wanted to capture him, torture him, and make his death such a brutal example that no one would ever dare to challenge him again. The border transformed into a hunting ground, but this time Pedro was the prey. El Carnicero mobilized all his resources. Dozens of sicarios scoured the desert. Checkpoints were set up on dirt roads, and bounties were offered to anyone, including federal police and border patrols, who could provide information on the Justicier's whereabouts. The vast desert, which was once Pedro's sanctuary and weapon, began to shrink, its endless escape possibilities turning into an ever-tightening labyrinth. The solitude that once gave him strength now became a burden, as he was completely alone against a killing machine. The pressure was suffocating. Every shadow seemed like a threat, every distant sound a sign of danger. Pedro was forced to move constantly, unable to rest, eating and sleeping little, living purely on instinct and adrenaline. His connection with Elena became his only lifeline, a thin thread to the outside world. Her messages, left in secret locations, were fragments of information that kept him one step ahead of the wolf pack on his trail. But the strain was taking its toll. The physical exhaustion was immense, but the mental wear was even worse. The relentless chase was turning him into a cornered animal, eroding the cold discipline he had built. The end almost came on a moonless night. Following a false lead planted by El Carnicero to test for potential leaks in his organization, Pedro walked straight into a trap. Dozens of men surrounded him in an old abandoned ranch. The shootout was an inferno of muzzle flashes and splintering wood. Pedro survived by sheer luck and wild instinct, using the darkness and confusion to his advantage to escape through an underground passage he had noticed on his approach. He escaped, but not unscathed. With a new bullet wound in his leg and his confidence shaken, he realized how close he had come to the end. His enemy was not just brutal, he was cunning. Dragging himself and bleeding, he took the only path he could, back to Father Miguel's mission. He collapsed at the church door, a broken man, and the priest took him in once more. As he tended to his wounds, the priest didn't say, "I told you so." Instead, his eyes were filled with a deep sadness. "For how much longer, Pedro?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Look at you. You've become a ghost, hunted by demons. This isn't justice. It's a slow form of suicide." The priest's words hit Pedro harder than any bullet, for he knew they were true. He was destroying himself in his quest to destroy others. The forced recovery in the small church gave Pedro a rare moment for introspection. Surrounded by the peaceful silence of the sanctuary, he reflected on his journey. The rage that drove him still burned, but now he saw its limitations. His war of attrition was failing. He was one man against a hydra. Cutting off one head only made two more vicious ones grow in its place. He realized Father Miguel was right. Continuing like this would lead to his death or turn him into an exact copy of the monster he hunted. Vengeance could not be an uncontrolled wildfire. It needed to be a lightning strike, precise and final, hitting the heart of the storm. His decision was made. He would no longer hunt the minions. He would no longer hide in the shadows, reacting to his enemy's moves. He would become the alpha predator once more. He would hunt El Carnicero. It was a suicide mission, an all-or-nothing gamble, but it was the only path left. It was the only way to end the cycle of violence and perhaps find some form of peace for the souls he carried, especially Sophia's. He no longer just wanted to avenge her death. He wanted to honor the promise he made her, even in a twisted and bloody way. He would ensure that the monster who took her would never see another sunrise. He contacted Eleanor with his new plan. At first, she called him crazy, suicidal. "You can't get near him. He lives in a fortress," she protested. But when she saw the icy determination in Pedro's eyes, she knew she couldn't dissuade him. Instead, her pragmatism kicked in. If Pedro was going to attempt the impossible, she would give him the best possible chance. She activated her network of contacts, risking everything to find the one thing that could bring down a man like El Carnicero. His routine, his arrogance. She discovered a pattern, a single moment when he let his guard down, a ritual he performed far from his fortress. Elena's information was a poisoned gift, a deadly opportunity. El Carnicero had a fascination with the desert. Once every lunar cycle, during the seasonal sandstorm, he would go alone to a specific location, a rocky plateau he considered his throne, to feel the force of nature. It was an act of supreme arrogance, a way of proving himself stronger than the desert itself. For anyone else, going into the desert during a sandstorm was a death sentence. For Pedro, it was an invitation. It was the perfect arena, a battlefield where technology and numbers didn't matter, only knowledge of the land and the will to survive. The final hunt was set, the stage for the confrontation. Between the two demons of the desert was ready. The sky turned into an apocalyptic canvas of bruised yellow and gray. The wind didn't blow, it screamed, a tangible force that whipped the landscape with lashes of sand. For any other man, this would be hell. For Pedro, it was the ideal environment. He moved through the tempest with a ghostly familiarity, his face covered, his eyes adjusted to the near-zero visibility. The deafening roar masked his footsteps, and the chaos was his camouflage. Upon reaching the edge of the rocky plateau, he saw him, El Carnicero, standing against the fury of the elements, a defiant silhouette. He saw himself as a god, believing he could master the wild, little knowing that the true predator of that desert was not the wind or the sand, but the man watching him from the shadows, ready for the final kill. The hunt began in silence. Pedro didn't use a bullet, but the very psychology of fear that his enemy loved to employ. He became a poltergeist in the storm. A loose rock tumbled down a cliff face to El Carnicero's left, a sharp, dry sound that barely rose above the howling wind. Moments later, a strange whistle, mimicking a bird of prey, seemed to come from the opposite direction. The cartel leader, initially unfazed, began to show unease. His dominion over this place was an illusion, and he was beginning to feel it. The plateau, his sanctuary of power, was turning into a trap, and the feeling of being the hunter was rapidly draining away, replaced by the cold dread of being the prey. The terror deepened when Pedro allowed himself to be seen, but only for split seconds. A silhouette that appeared and vanished in the curtain of sand, always on the periphery of El Carnicero's vision. The storm itself seemed to conspire against him, appearing to whisper a name amidst its roar. Sophia. The sound, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to the killer's guilty conscience, was enough to break his composure. He drew his weapon, firing frantically at the dancing shadows, his useless shots swallowed by the immense roar of the storm. The master of fear was now its student, trapped in a labyrinth of sand and haunted by the ghost of his cruelest crime. From the fog of dust, Pedro attacked. The fight that followed was not a gunslinger's duel, but a savage hand-to-hand brawl under the worst imaginable conditions. Firearms were useless. It was a battle of knives, fists, and the pure will to kill. El Carnicero was strong, a brute, accustomed to violence, and he fought with the ferocity of a cornered beast. But Pedro was no longer just a man. He was a force of nature, driven by an icy fury and a singular purpose. They rolled across the rocks, the pain of cuts and bruises muffled by adrenaline, and the deafening noise of the wind. It was a primal clash, two monsters trying to annihilate each other in the heart of a world that was falling apart around them. Feeling the fight turn against him, El Carnicero used his vilest weapon. In a moment, when he managed to pin Pedro, he brought his bloody face close and spat the words with sadistic pleasure. "You're here for the little girl, aren't you? Little Sophia," he gasped. I remember her eyes well as she begged. Such a pathetic sound. It was a pleasure to break that little toy. Each word was a stab, calculated to drown Pedro in a blind rage, to make him lose focus and make a mistake. He believed that Pedro's pain was his greatest weakness, the key to turning the tide of this desperate battle in his favor, turning the justiciar into an irrational and easily slain beast. But the taunt had the opposite effect. The mention of Sophia, evoked so profanely, did not break Pedro. Instead, it forged him. All his pain, all his guilt, and all his hatred, which once consumed him in a chaotic fire, suddenly concentrated into a single point of absolute, lethal clarity. The girl's image did not blind him. It became the sight on his weapon. In that moment, Pedro's transformation was complete. He was no longer a man driven by revenge, but the embodiment of a promise he had made to a child. The rage was no longer hot and impulsive. It became cold, heavy, and precise as the blade of a guillotine. He stopped fighting for himself and began fighting for her. The shift in dynamics was immediate and final. Pedro's movements became devoid of emotion, each blow delivered with deadly purpose. He exploited an opening left by El Carnicero's arrogance, broke the arm that held the knife, and brought him down with relentless force. The man who considered himself the king of the border lay at his feet, a dethroned sovereign in his palace of sand and wind. Pedro stood over him, his figure calm and terrible amidst the fury of the storm. There was no victory speech, no final words exchanged, only the howl of the desert and the silence of a debt about to be paid. With one swift, final motion, he ended El Carnicero's reign, leaving his body to be buried by the same storm he believed he commanded. When the storm finally subsided, it left behind a deep, clean silence. The morning sun rose on a desert freshly sculpted by the wind, the sand gently covering El Carnicero's body like a natural shroud. Pedro stood there, exhaustion seeping into his bones now that the adrenaline had faded. He had expected to feel something, relief, triumph, catharsis. But what flooded him was an absolute void, an absence as vast and desolate as the landscape around him. The fire of vengeance that had defined him, fueled him, and driven him for so long had burned itself out, and in its place there was no peace, only the deafening echo of his own hollow soul. He had killed his demon, but now he was alone in the darkness. His return to civilization was the pilgrimage of a ghost. He was no longer the man on fire who had gone to war. He was only the ashes that remained. Upon arriving at the mission, he found Father Miguel sweeping the entrance as if it were any other day. The priest looked at him, and in his eyes there was no judgment, no triumph, only an infinite sad compassion. Pedro entered the small chapel, walked to the simple wooden altar, and from his pocket he took the small carved wooden bird. He placed it gently beside a candle. It was the end of his journey, a silent act of surrender, acknowledging that his bloody revenge had not redeemed Sophia's memory. It had only chained him to it forever. Pedro knew he could no longer live among men. The identity of Pedro María, the COYOTE, was dead and buried in the desert along with his enemy. He had no more desires, no ambitions. All the money he had taken from the cartel, a sum that could have bought him a new life anywhere in the world, he left anonymously for Father Miguel with a note that only said, "For those who still have hope." He had no need for money or a new beginning. His identity was now the dark legend he himself had forged with blood and fear. He was El Escorpión, a faceless, nameless force, a cautionary tale told by criminals and a whisper of hope for the desperate. Some time later, far from there, a new group of migrants, exhausted and vulnerable, made their way through a rocky canyon. They didn't know they were being watched by a small group of bandits, predators who saw their desperation as an opportunity for easy profit. But these predators were also being watched. From a higher ridge, camouflaged among the rocks, a lone figure watched them. It was Pedro. His face, leaner, weathered by the sun and by grief, was that of a man in eternal penance. He no longer felt the burn of rage, only the weight of a grim, perpetual duty. Silently, he began to move down the ridge, a dark guardian moving to protect the innocent, his personal purgatory and his only form of atonement. Pedro's justice cost him his soul, but in his damnation he found a strange and bitter form of redemption. He did not find the peace he sought, but he became the peace for others, a dreaded guardian angel who haunted the desert trails, ensuring that no other monster like El Carnicero could reign with impunity. The legend of the coyote who became a justiciar was cemented, a story of fire and blood told in whispers. His journey ends here, not with a happy ending, but with a purpose found in the void. If this story of transformation and sacrifice has touched you, know that your support, by subscribing, is what allows me to continue giving a voice to these silent battles. Thank you so much for being with me until the end.